right. So yeah, thank you everybody for this chance to do I suppose a bit of a follow-up to the thing that I did about a month ago. Just introducing what is the structure and the history and the origins of the this deep state structure. But we're more familiar with its contours in the United States. I think people are still a little bit ambiguous about the nature of what it is, how it operated, why it operates in the case of Canada's history. So if you haven't seen the last presentation, maybe you could ask Ted for a link to that. Just going through the Rhodes Scholarship, the Fabian Society networks, and how they influence pretty much everything bad um, in Canada for the past 120 years. So a couple of weeks ago, as people know, Trump met with Putin. This selection of the Arctic, of specifically Alaska, was interesting, and it brought a lot of people's focus onto the question of the Arctic per se, and Canada being a major Arctic nation, um, from the standpoint of the geostrategy of what does that mean? What does this signify? And a lot of people didn't know that Alaska was once Russian up until not that long ago. In fact, the sale of Alaska by the Russians to the United States and the creation of the British North America Act, having both happened in 1867, is not a coincidence, just separated by a few months. And that historical anomaly, I think, is actually a good jump on point to unpack a lot of the weird peculiarities about the strange structure of Canada. Why do we have a government governed by a privy council office, governor generals, unelected deputy ministers, and much of the chain of command and the decision making apparatus that defines what is going to be domestic and foreign policy tends not to have much to do most of the time with the elected aspect of our government, but rather this other thing that even political science professors that I've spoken to have very little understanding about what its actual influence is and why it operates. So I told that I can't do this in 20 minutes. I did the last presentation in 20 minutes. I can't do this in 20 minutes. So he said, okay, take 45. I'll take 45. And then maybe we'll have time for a bit of a dialogue. I don't know if you have a lot packed into your schedule, so we'll see. So let me do a screen share here. So let's start this up with a PowerPoint. All right, I'll have to breeze through this. I might have made more slides than I should have, but anyway, it's so I call this Canada as a wedge between US Russian alliance, an untold history of Canada lecture. A lot of the content, here you full screen. A lot of the content that you'll find that you'll hear me speak about can be found specifically in my second volume of the Untold History of Canada, there on the left, In Defense of Manifest Destiny, Recapturing the Mischance of 1867. That's volume two. Volume three is the one with Diefenbaker and Daniel Johnson de Gaulle there. Volume one is with Ben Franklin, and volume four deals with the content that I went through in the last presentation on the Rhodes Scholarship, the Rhodes Trust Network, and the different think tanks that operated um, through the Privy Council office and other things. So that content is there for people who want to do a bit more digging. It's available on Amazon, or there's PDFs that people can get for free if you write to me. First anomaly: why is Canada so underdeveloped? If you look at the population density demographic statistics for the continent of North America, you see that the population density is pretty weak in Canada, right? So the US is a lot more development, way more people. Canada, our country, as you can see it, is really, really mostly 95% or maybe 92% strung up along the US border where there is, civilizational development. The vast majority has remained uninhabited, undeveloped. Why is that? Is it just that we don't like the cold? No, I think people can work in the cold, and look at Russia. It gets a lot colder up in St. Petersburg. It's way more north. They've got a lot more development. Um, we're not that different in terms of age from the civilization that had grown up in the colonies in the United States, or what became the United States. So why is there maybe an agenda or an intention or a set of ideas that is manifested in the obstruction of the opening up of the North, when we know that there has been a long history of efforts to try to bring civilization there? Another anomaly for Canadians trying to make sense of what is this thing called Canada? What is this monarchy of the North? Jefferson Davis, for those who don't know, Jefferson Davis Was going to be the president of the Confederacy, the Southern Confederacy Project that was, you know, that nearly tore up the Union back in the first Civil War, 1860, 61 to 65. After that was put down by Lincoln, he came to Canada with many other leading Confederates. Canada was a Confederate intelligence hub after all. There's a book called The City of Secrets by Barry Sheehy from 2017 that outlined exactly the different Confederate hubs in Montreal, Toronto, Kingston, of which John Wilkes Booth was even brought up here for 5 weeks to receive money, pay, directives to go down and kill Lincoln with a broader network. That's very well documented. So he saw safe terrain, sort of sanctuary where he brought his family, lived many years before he went to England with Judah Benjamin, the Confederate Secretary of State, head of Secret Service for the Confederacy. And he gave a speech just outside in Lennoxville, Quebec, to a bunch of affectionate fans saying, I hope that you will hold fast to their British principles and that you may ever strive to cultivate close, affectionate connections with the mother country. What's this guy talking about? This guy's like an American Confederate slave power. He was going to be the head of the Order of the Golden Circle, this slave empire of the Golden Circle that was supposed to expand. And you can see the maps online of what they wanted to do after they achieved independence. They were going to expand that system all throughout Latin America, Central America, South America. People can Google that. This guy's coming to Canada, encouraging us to, is July 1867, to embrace our British principles. It's a bit weird. I like anomalies. This is like good jump off points for a story, usually, where things don't fit a popular narrative. This is in Montreal, Canada, at the Hudson Bay Company, or Hudson Bay. Yeah, there's still a department store, though I think they went bankrupt. They're still there in downtown Montreal, and the plaque was only removed in 2020, which is an honorary plaque memorializing Jefferson Davis and where he stayed. That was the place where that was an apartment where he stayed at a Hudson Bay owned building back in those days in Montreal. So they have a plaque even today, up until 5 years ago, memorializing Jefferson Davis. So our founding fathers that Jefferson Davis was interfacing with have some peculiar remarks. Um, One of those things that Johnny MacDonald had said was that I would be quite willing personally to leave the whole of a whole country a wilderness for the next half century, but I fear that if Englishmen do not go there, the Yankees will. This is a man who said, "An Englishman I was born, and an Englishman I will die." This is the George Washington of Canada, the guy who's lionized as the great father of the founding fathers of Confederation of the Canadian so-called nation, saying, championing how much he really doesn't want to develop Canada. And he's talking about the unfortunate obligation to extend rail lines to the west because if he doesn't go there, he's aware that when he's speaking in 1867, the Yankees will, and he's right, the Yankees would. And that's a picture of him kissing the hand of Queen Victoria. And he, like I said, he said he was also known as the one of the most racist members of Parliament. And I'm not trying to be a Black Lives Matter guy here. He literally passed a bill. He introduced a bill calling for an only Aryan Canada, that only people who have Aryan Teutonic blood should be allowed to vote. People could say, "Oh, but this guy that was the age he was living in, forgive him." It's like he was the only one. Most other members of Parliament were horrified that he did that, and they said no. They struck the bill down. So just to say, this guy had a few screws loose. There's other weird things that are said by other fathers of Confederation, like Sir Alexander Galt, who said in May 22nd that if the United States desires to outflank us on the west, we must accept the situation and lay our hand on British Columbia and the Pacific Ocean. This country cannot be surrounded by the United States. We are gone if we allow it. From the Atlantic to the Pacific must be the cry of British America, as much as it has ever been in the United States. So he's calling for the need to try to create to unleash the shackles that had been withholding industrial progress in Canada, because so up until then we'd been a land of the hewer of wood and draw of water. The British never allowed us to have industry. We're only supposed to be resource extractive, fur trapping peoples that would not be too developed, more easy to control. So all of a sudden they're like, well, maybe we have to allow some industrial development because the Canadians are looking over their border and they're seeing the Americans grow in quality of life. They're industrializing, they're using protectionism, they're using the power of the nation state, and they kind of want that too. And if we don't give them a little of what's happening right beside them, they're gonna join. They're gonna work with the United States. Um, Georges Cartier, the other founder of Confederation, got him there with a map of the Hudson Rupert's Land, Hudson Bay Land, private land that it was nationalized only in 1869, where he said, in this country, we must have a distinct form of government which will be in which the monarchical spirit will be found. And again, they're looking at a land which is different from today's Canada. It didn't look at all right. We had like 70% of Canada was privately owned Rupert's Land, set up in 1670. You had a few colonies, four colonies on the East Coast. You had one separate colony way over there in British Columbia called British Columbia, separated by this giant, expansive private land. Um, and then eventually, by 1885, our first intercontinental rail line was built, and that was the outcome of John A. Macdonald's national policy, a policy that involved taking certain mechanisms of what was done in the United States. Protective tariffs was one thing, and doing it in a manner that allowed for the building of this rail line. But I would contend that this was done to prevent a much greater natural organic good from unfolding, which I'm going to go through in this story. This was not, though good things happened, it was good that we developed rail. It was good that we did this. I'm not saying that, but there's degrees of this. And when you're dealing with game masters like we have with the highest echelons of the British Empire at that time, there was a much greater good for humanity as a whole that would have dissolved the power structures of this global one world government. And there really was only one world government at that time, which was the British Empire, the empire in which the sun never set. And it was a brutal, eugenics based, genocidal empire. And people knew that. Just look at India or Ireland. And that was not done by accident. And people could say that it looks a little similar to what America did. This is the completion of the Trans-Continental Rail Line that was finished in 1869, begun in 1863 amidst the Civil War by Lincoln. It was finished, looks, similar as an idea, but what's being left out of this picture? What was the intention of things at those days? And how did the British North America Act of 1867 play a big role in preventing an outcome that would have involved a U.S., Russian, Canadian mutual development strategy that Lincoln, Tsar Alexander II, and many other patriots around the world were working towards? So let's just do a quick comparison. This is what we got locked into in 1867, just a little bit after, a few months after, 2 months after the sale of Alaska was accomplished. We had all of a sudden the ramming through of this thing. This was actually written in 1864 when the Civil War was still raging. That's when the draft was actually written over the course of about 30 days of booze-soaked partying and orgies in the Maritimes. They drafted this thing, sent it to London. It was finally passed as a bill. And if you read it, we're going to compare the logic versus what's in the U.S. founding documents. So in our so-called founding document, our Constitution, it says, whereas these provinces have expressed their desire to be federally united into one dominion under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom, and whereas such a union would conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. So our principal purpose in our preamble is to promote the interests of the British Empire. That's a strange constitution. Be it therefore enacted and declared that by the Majesty's most loyal, excellent Majesty, and with the advice of the consent of the Lord spiritual and temporal. Okay, and it goes on, and just then you could read the Constitution and how it codifies the power structures. Compare that now, contrast that with the case of the United States, which has a constitution which is much more clear and defined about what it is. When it says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Very different idea, not for the interests of an empire, not to say that America couldn't slip into the corruption of becoming an empire, which it has from time to time, much of the time, I would say. But the point is, in the principled idea, the moral concept is much stronger, much less ambiguous about the nature of, like, where does the power arise? And if you look at the other founding document of the U.S., it's very clear that rights are inalienable. They're not something given by a monarch or a sovereign. Everybody is sovereign and everybody has rights because they're inalienable. We're born and made in the living image of God. And as such, we have rights. There's nobody born into a better family by a better bloodline who has better rights than others who are born into slave families. Whereas in the case of the Canadian language of our founding documents, which is the case across all British legal documents of this sort, you'll find that rights are something given and thus can be also implicitly taken away when expedient, as we see the shifty language of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that Pierre Elliott Trudeau oversaw back in the day, which allows all sorts of loopholes and doesn't really recognize rights as being universal. The way that the Diefenbaker Bill of Rights is much more effective at recognizing that there's a universality, that there's not different rights for different kinds of people or anything like that. And there's no loopholes out of which somebody can get across avoiding rights. So again, just to look once again at the map, right? That getting the mindset back into 1860, 65, 66, 67. Rupert's Land makes up a big chunk of Canada. It's ridiculous how much this privately owned, it's like a subsidiary of the British East India Company, represented. It's over the top. And like I said, you got New Caledonia there, what becomes British Columbia, Vancouver Island. You got the four colonies of the East that confederate. And one of the polemics I get across in my books is that the British Empire had two Confederate projects to destroy the successes of 1776. The victory of the first time in a world the nation was able to create a viable republic founded upon universal principles was 1776. And the obsession to destroy that has been nonstop, and it's still nonstop to this very day. The two Confederacy projects that were activated at that time in the 1860s involved one which failed, the Southern Confederacy Project, which again had a lot of British hands. And I'm saying British, when I say British, I don't mean the British people or Parliament. Again, I'm talking about the shadow government. I'm talking about the City of London. I'm talking about the East India Company and their intelligence networks. I'm talking about the United Empire, the United Grand Lodge as the dominant, Masonic lodge that moderates the different behavior of the various subsidiary lodges that are embedded within intelligence communities in various parts of the world. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. Um, and the Northern Confederacy succeeded where the Southern Confederacy failed. So what's happening here in British Columbia? They're isolated. They have no connection to the eastern colonies. The only economic development in the 1860s that's going on in New Caledonia and Vancouver Island is with California. They had a big gold rush in the 1850s. It popped. So you had 30,000 civilians, 20,000 prospectors living in this area that's now got no economy to speak of whatsoever. They're in massive debt. They're drowning. So there's a big fervor, especially when it's clear that the union is not going to dissolve and that a big burst of progress is underway in the United States. There's a big desire to feed our families and get a viable economy. And so there's a movement that starts up. It was already there, but it gets really loud, of the BC annexation movement. And we have the American consul to Victoria, Alan Francis, who wrote to, I guess it was Andrew Johnson at the time in 1868, the then president, saying that even the colonists claiming most loyalty to the Queen are now urging with great unanimity annexation to the United States as their only salvation, as the only means of retrieving the colonies from their present embarrassment and decline. The biggest newspaper of the day in British Columbia was The Colonist. In 1867, they had an op-ed on the front page that says, since no change would be for the worse, they, the British Columbians, would welcome annexation to the United States to continuing in a state of poverty and wretchedness. In writing this, we know we speak the mind of 9 out of every 10 men in the colony. The sentiment is heard at every gathering street corner, at social gatherings, in business circles, in all places. There's an official annexation petition. There were several, actually. This is the first one on July 2nd, 1867, to Queen Victoria, where the leading merchants and leaders of British Columbia said either that Your Majesty's government may be pleased to relieve us immediately of the expense of our excessive staff of officials. The bureaucracy was overinflated even in those days. It's not a new thing. Immediately, assist the establishment of a British steam line with the Panamas. That's where the British had another colony, and they could feasibly create an economy or some economic relationship there, so that immigration from England may more easily reach us. and also assume the debts of the colonies, or that your majesty will graciously permit the colony to become a portion of the United States. And again, that these went unanswered for they were never answered. But there are many of these petitions that are all published. They're all still found online. Okay, so we got that going on. We got a fervor. We got a fervor going on. The U.S. has survived this this scary moment. 500,000 Americans have died. Russia soon starts building trans its own Trans-Siberian Railway, stretching from ocean to ocean. Some of the leading figures who are the architects of this Trans-Siberian Railway include Count Sergeyevich, the first finance minister, then foreign minister, and later first prime minister of Russia. Sergeyevich, there featured on the upper left. You got Dmitry Mendeleev, the great scientist who discovered the periodic table, who's also the chair of the Committee for the Protective Tariff, who comes to Philadelphia in 1876 and studies how America was able to utilize protective tariff system and apply it for the development of their natural resources and uplift the people in opposition to British free trade, which he polemicizes against extensively. And people can read those in my book, those speeches he gives. Then you have Vishnegradsky, the finance minister, who's a big friend of Abraham Lincoln and an admirer, and Tsar Alexander II, the great liberator who freed 25 million serfs the year before Lincoln declares the Emancipation Proclamation, and the man who oversaw, who sent the Russian Navy fleets in 1863 to the coast of the United States on the east and west coast, where there were Russian sailors celebrated for coming to save the Union because it was known that that the Tsar had said that if Britain officially go in with France as empires supporting the Confederate South openly, we know they're doing it covertly, but if they come out doing it openly, it will be casus belli war with Russia, which kept them at bay and gave Lincoln the space he needed to carry out the fight with the greenbacks and other things. So you got the Russian thing going on, you got the Canadian thing going on, you got British Columbia clamoring for some survival, and then you got William Seward. William Seward there featured in a wonderful painting celebrating the sale of Alaska. Ambassador de Stokel, Edward de Stokel, is also there with his hand on the globe over Alaska. And this is the March 30th purchase of the Treaty of Cessation for $7 million. Alaska was sold. Very big deal. So you got that. Seward, by the way, is a guy who was the Secretary of State under of Lincoln. He got his own assassination attempt. The night that Lincoln was shot, an assassin came into his room while he was convalescing and stabbed him 20 times that very night. Now, the reason why he didn't die through 20 stab wounds and was able to go back to work a few months later, and he's partially because he's tough. People were tougher then, I guess. But not only that, he was convalescing because he had been a week earlier thrown under a carriage, and so many bones were broken that he had like an exoskeleton in his bed. And luckily, the exoskeleton prevented the knife from hitting any vital organs. So this guy was next level, but he continued to organize for Lincoln's strategy. Um, and he wasn't alone. Like this is not just a conspiracy theory that people could easily ignore. Like this is the Ambassador Stokel to Gorchakov right before the Civil War, when Stokel is saying, the disintegration of the United States as a nation would, from our point of view, be something to be deplored. The American Confederation has acted as a counterpoise to British power, and in this sense, its continued existence constitutes an important element in the balance of power. He continued that he desired the preservation of the American Union as an indivisible nation. So the Russians have a very high priority on both saving the US, but then creating something with the US after the Civil War. And I mentioned the Russian Navy coming to the U.S. This is from a U.S. Journal at the time, which celebrated the Russian Navy, featuring some of the the major warships that were sent down in New York. We have also, like I said, the reception of the Common Council Committee of Admiral Lvovsky from the Alexander Nevsky ship, who's brought in and welcomed by U.S. politicians and celebrated by the people as a whole. These are the Russian visitors, the Russian sailors, at a parade in through Broadway. So the Russians were really recognized as the saviors of the United States at a time of crisis. Tsar Alexander II says, In the autumn of 1862, the governments of France and Great Britain proposed to Russia, in a formal but not unofficial official way, the joint recognition by European powers of the independence of the Confederate States of America. My immediate answer was, I will not cooperate in such an action, and I will not acquiesce. On the contrary, I shall accept the recognition of the independence of the Confederate States of France and Great Britain as a casus belli for Russia. And in order for the governments of France and Great Britain may understand that this is no idle threat, I will send a Pacific fleet to San Francisco and an Atlantic fleet to New York. All this I did because of love for my own dear Russia. I acted thus because I understood that Russia would have a more serious task to perform if the American Republic, with advanced industrial development, were broken up and Great Britain should be left in control of most branches of modern industrial development. And finally, last Russian quote here, General Nikolai Muraviev, writing to Tsar Alexander II, he said that the ultimate fate of the United States over the whole of North America is so natural that we must ourselves sooner or later recede. But we must recede peacefully, in return for which we might receive other advantages from the Americans. Due to the present amazing development of railroads, the United States will soon spread over all of North America. We must face the fact that we will have to cede our North American possessions to them. So there's a certain real politic, a real recognition of where the world's kind of moving at that time. And this was done before the Civil War as well. This is 1860 that he's saying this. So there's some foresight here. And Lincoln had a close friend of his, by the name of William Gilpin, who was his bodyguard. He was known as the father of manifest destiny. He was the earliest champion, or one of the earliest champions, for the Trans-Continental Railway. In starting in 1843, he began mobilizing through conferences and other things the idea of building a nation that would become independent of British shipping and maritime control by building internally a rail system that would give an impetus for the opening up of new industries, new cities, new development, and a higher quality of thinking for those who would be in a culture that would thus be engineering oriented, future oriented, because you have to think very far into the future and very big to build these sorts of things. And so William Gilpin, after being appointed as the first governor of Colorado Territory during the Civil War, Gilpin, and this is again, became Lincoln's trusted bodyguard, and he was the man who saved Lincoln. He played the biggest role in saving Lincoln upon his journey from Illinois to Washington when there was a Confederate attempt on Lincoln's life. They had a decoy set up to go in at a different location. And then Lincoln gave him the task of stopping the opening up of a Western front. There was a Southern front, a Northern front. So Confederate operations were attacking Lincoln from the north through Montreal, running things like the Albany raids. You had the major battle lines in the South, but there was an attempt to open up a Western front, which Gilpin put down when he was governor of Colorado, thus probably saving the Union as well. And after that, he became an international organizer for the extension of the the Trans-Continental to connect to the Trans-Siberian through British Columbia. And that's a map that he commissioned with engineers that he was working with in 1890, called the Gilpin's American Economic Just and Correct Map of the World with a Pacific focus, featuring the Bering Strait as a connecting line with rail lines uniting various nations of the world around cooperation instead of exploitation by a hegemon. That's a picture of Gilpin right there, and that's the celebration of the connection of the East and the West lines that made the Transcontinental rail line work. And the thing that I forgot to mention is that the Trans-Siberian Railway was actually built with American locomotives and rail lines that were manufactured in Philadelphia. So many people don't know this, but in Russia, the first rail cars to travel across the Siberian uh, in 1905, when it was finally finished, were made in Philadelphia Baldwin locomotives, and it was American rail engineers who were brought to assist in the construction of this line alongside people like Sergei Witte, Mendeleev, and others. So extremely important. And this was explicitly said by Lincoln in 1864 before he died. He gave a State of the Union address to Congress, and he said that the proposed overland telegraph between America and Europe by way of the Bering Straits and Asiatic Russia, which was sanctioned by Congress at the last session, has been undertaken under very favorable circumstances. Assurances have been received from most of the South American states of their high appreciation of the enterprise and their readiness to cooperate in constructing lines tributary to the world in circulating communication. Now, Lincoln at the time was talking about specifically telegraph lines moving through the Bering Strait, but many other people as well were talking also about the obviousness of building rail. Of course, there's only 100 kilometers of distance between Russian Alaska, and Russia proper, um, which would have made it, even in those days, an engineering possibility. Today, it's much more doable, especially with the London Channel and things. I mean, engineering, especially tunneling, has gone much further. At the time, it would have been probably a bridge, but this could be done pretty easily, and we're going to see actually how far it's come. And it just to
Matt,
remind people that, oh yeah,
we've
go on.
we've got about a little more than 10 minutes, Matt. I'm wondering if you
Oh, and
could.
I got it. Oh yeah, don't worry. Yeah,
Great,
I'm
thanks.
pacing myself. Don't worry. To see the petrification of somebody who's looking at the world like a board game when the rules of the game are entirely wired to maritime shipping and the control of nodes. Simply by controlling 13 or so strategic choke points around the world, these core ports around the Cape of Good Hope, Straits of Malacca, um, Britain was able to pretty much control the system of production and flow of goods everywhere, and thus control the levers of depopulation much more readily and population control much more readily. That was the Malthusian wiring that was built into the British governing class that was making policy and promoting a very dishonest version of free trade, saying free trade for everybody except England. They get protectionism because they have to have the monopoly on manufacturing, whereas India, Ireland, the US, Canada, Australia, they must have free trade to stay underdeveloped, because if they develop too much, they might get ideas in their minds that you know give them this foolish idea that they can be independent, which they shouldn't. In Russia, today, just so people know, this is a statue of Lincoln and Tsar Alexander II, two martyred, both men assassinated by operations tied to the city of London, shaking hands. Now, they never actually met in person, just to be clear. However, they were both on the same page. They were both collaborating. They were both corresponding with this common strategy and a common understanding of the enemy, which killed both of them. And this is in Moscow today, and it's been there for a number of years. Something that is much more familiar in the minds of Russians who cherish this period in history much more than Canadians or Americans who take this for granted. Um, they have specials on primetime Russian TV celebrating the Russian American friendship of the 19th century. Like I've been asked to speak on a number of these primetime shows. It's like this is stuff that you would normally expect in fringe alternative conspiracy land in North America. These are like commonly discussed topics. Um, Yeah, and just to be clear, like the types of statues we seem to be lionizing here involve things like Albert Pike, the Confederate general who was a top leader of the Order of the Golden Circle and later co-founder of the KKK, that Scottish Rite Grand Master who reformed Scottish Rite Freemasonry, um, the Satanist, the self-professed Satanist, right? This is the type of character whose statue is in Washington, D.C., was taken down during the. This is the one of I'm against statues being ripped down by anarchists. I'm against that. Just to be clear, this was one of the statues that were taken down during the Black Lives Matter craziness. That I was like, okay, I'm okay with that one being taken down. The thing that bothers me is that this was also ripped down with Frederick Douglass, who became a black slave who became the advisor of Abraham Lincoln and the first or one of the leading ambassadors to Haiti. His statues were also ripped down by idiot Black Lives Matter protesters. They never reinstated Frederick Douglass's statues. They did reinstate Albert Pike a few weeks ago to Washington, D.C. For me, that means that there's a problem in the wiring, in the thinking of something shaping the United States right now. I am sympathetic with, I love MAGA. I love I hope for the best for Trump. I don't trust transhumanists who seem to also have a lot of influence around Trump. But there's also something weird that is glorifying or bringing back something that should not be glorified in the core of Washington, D.C. And for those, again, who don't know, I mentioned the Order of the Golden Circle, the Empire of the Golden Circle. That's the literal map of what the Empire of the Golden Circle wanted for the Confederate States. They had published these maps back in the 1860s, which would have involved expanding the power of the slave empire with a special relationship with Great Britain. Great Britain was, after all, buying 80% of Southern cotton, so that was a big economic determinant of what the Confederacy could do. They had no industry, they had no real manufacturing, but they had a lot of 4 million slaves and a whole economy with where most white people were also in poverty. In poverty, most white people didn't own slaves. This is like a an oligarchical inbred slaveocracy that had a view of expansionism. So this is something that I could see the danger of this when I look at some of the neocons that speak of things like the Golden Dome, which even Carney has spoken well of as an idea of or at least, you could even look at the old technocracy groups that Elon Musk's grandfather used to run back in the 30s in Canada and Saskatchewan when he was talking about the technate of North America as the ambition of creating a centralized post-nation state system controlled by a managerial scientific elite of transhumanists that seems to be reviving in popular circles amongst Silicon Valley billionaires like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk today, who are reviving certain toxic ideas that represent some of the worst elements of American history. So I leave it with that. The last slide I just put on is just something showcasing the current dynamic, which I'm hoping Trump and saner conservative leaders of North America and maybe even increasingly Europe might see that the Polar Silk Road, which was something created by Putin and Xi Jinping in 2019, might be something that we could work with instead of militarizing the Arctic, which Carney has said that he wants to do with Australia, is militarizing the Arctic and keeping the Arctic undeveloped from anything that would benefit U.S. Russian collaboration. Carney has been explicit on saying no to that and saying yes to militarization. Long range missiles have been accepted. They're not stationed yet, but that's part of the new Arctic strategy. Again, oh, I forgot I had a couple more slides. Putin did offer in 2007 and 2011 to build Bering Strait rail tunnel connecting Russia to Alaska and said that they'll spend $60 billion of this. That was rejected by Bush, Cheney, and then it was rejected by Obama. I'm hoping that this dialogue is still in play today. Trump did in 2020 provide executive order to support the building of the rail line from Alberta to Alaska and connecting the lower 48 states for the first time. That would have been a nice idea. It was sabotaged. The A2A doesn't exist, but Peter Schultz, who was the key guy behind engineer planner within this A2A network, is still active brainstorming and networking. So he's somebody you guys might want to even have on in a future show. And that's a little comment by Trump saying, congratulations to the people of Alaska and Canada for this A2A cross-border thing, which hopefully can be revived in some form. Again, this is the Polar Silk Road of Russia and China, which is a non-militaristic way of looking at the Arctic from the standpoint of how can we cooperate and work together to reject the depopulation agenda and this new one world government network state transhumanist thing. So I think with that, I've said my bit, and there might be time for like 3 minutes of questions. I don't know. Yeah. Ted, it's all yours.
Yeah, I see Anne has got her hand up, but it doesn't look like Anne. Is that you, Bob?
Oh, you're on mute.
That's me. That's my wife is in control of everything, so I
Uh,
bet everybody else's is as well. Would you have thought that when they took the Tsar and family into the forest for a walk, if Britain had, or the Russians had done the same to Britain at that time, if they could have, would we be any better off? And one more thing, I love history. But we know history is made up of words and not necessarily truth. I'll leave it there. I'm a skeptic about everything that is said on the planet by man is there to assist man in accomplishing their goals. Or so to me, most things are lies, and probably a lot of what you have been doing, and it's beautiful. I love to hear it. It makes me feel so great to be knowledgeable, but we know very little about where we even came from as human beings, unless you believe in God. And one
so
other
let's
little
let,
thing.
let let's hear Matt respond,
Okay,
Bob.
yeah.
Thanks.
And one more thing. The Plunder of the Commons, a manifesto for sharing public wealth. is a nice little book for people to read and learn a little bit more. The Plunder of the Commons. Okay, thanks very much.
Well, I'm hoping that my presentation served as a bit of a teaser that may have whet people's appetite to dive in a little bit more into my actual work, written work that is highly footnoted and that involves a lot of original source material that I tried to bring to the surface in looking for things did happen. We have rail, we have electricity, we have running water, we have these freedoms, we have literacy. I know that 800 years ago, my feudal ancestors were mostly, ignorant, couldn't read, didn't have access to that. Even a century ago, average life expectancy in Canada was about 45 years of age, much higher infant mortality. So I know that there have been changes that I shouldn't take for granted. And the question is, did these improvements happen because the oligarchy that has been trying to manage the world as self-professed gods, because they just gave it to us? They got bored with people living in a dark age in ignorance and depopulation in the feudal era of the Crusades, and they just got bored and they wanted to create a renaissance, so they gave us these bursts of progress? Or were they fought for? In my analysis, I could see that they were fought for and they were sabotaged every step of the way. And the people who did the greatest good, who make these positive upshifts happen, were often willing to risk their lives and did, in fact, in many cases, get murdered, as Lincoln
Hello?
did. As Hi, Donna.
Hello?
Hi, Donna.
Anybody there?
Okay, can you mute
Yeah,
Hello?
Donna? Yeah.
if
All
somebody
right,
can
thanks.
mute Donna for me, thanks.
All right, cool. So look, my thing is just I encourage people to look at who made progress, who sabotaged progress, what did they say, and then what can we know about the current structures controlling the world today that were tied to the same type of thing that was shaping the world back then. I'm assuming that there is continuity, that it wasn't a different type of universe in 1867 than the one that's existing today. So that's my method. And again, people can read my books if you want to look into a little bit more of my method in detail.
Let's just get a
Thank you,
couple more
Bob.
questions here. David,
Yeah.
have you got a question for Matt?
You're talking to me?
Yes, I am, David.
Yeah, no, I just want to thank you so much for giving me Old Home Week information. For those that don't know, I'm actually in Canada because my family was chased out of Moscow as a result of the assassination attempts of the czars and my family connection. So I've always had a ear to the news as far as um, what my progression of thought is. Um, there are reasons that we should not be listening to the dialogue that was pushed on us during the Cold War, that Russians are terrible and they're all still communists and they're still our enemy. I was just watching a YouTube the other day about an aeronautic group who was working on the space station and cooperation in the upper atmosphere between Russia and the United States. And they're trying to revive that tunnel between Russia, between Alaska and Siberia. And when I saw the chart, I thought, well, this is interesting. The rail, like they're trying to revive with this 10-mile tunnel between, in that one small island. It has endpoints, Edmonton and Paris. So, if we're looking for something to put a smile on our face, like, wouldn't that be a wonderful trip to make? Get on a train in Edmonton and then go all the way to Paris. And I think the thing that's holding it back is a lot of people are still telling us that other nations are evil, and they make us forget who was an ally against the Nazis during the war.
Yeah,
Who cooperated with
absolutely.
us? When did we have all this shared history together? And it seems like every day, it's like the book 1984. We have to be continuously at war with these other people, and these other people seem to be the Russians. But when you look at the interviews with Putin, or you look at what this history that you so eloquently provided to us, really the hatred is not there, and these are not hardcore communists. Like, I'm here
No,
because we got away from the communists. We have a lot of allies between the two,
yeah.
and I
Yeah,
think
no, the,
it's
the Russians are
wonderful.
so the Russians are so desperate to be friends and to work with the United States and the West. They're so desperate. And they're naive as well. They're like, why don't we offer all of these things? We want to work together. We're being so
Yeah,
reasonable. Why do they hate us? Maybe if we just explain ourselves more, they will understand. And it's like, no, you guys don't. You guys don't understand.
yeah,
It's not your lack of explaining your thing. You're dealing with a
yeah.
dishonest death cult.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. Like,
yeah,
maybe the people of Canada and the people of Russia need to start a dialogue bypassing the mainstream media bypassing,
Correct.
what the governments are trying to do. Because I think we have a lot more in common than people realize. But it's been a thorough job, hasn't it? I mean, the hit job is there. When our parliamentarians stood up in Ottawa and clapped for a Nazi collaborator and an SS like I realize these people don't know any history at all. They're not looking at who's who on the chessboard. So thanks a lot for bringing this the history to us. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Matt, we're going to need to move on, but I just want to summarize. I think what you've brought forward is that we've been lied to about many pieces of our history. We've been deceived, and I also like the question you asked about how did we get development, and was it the elitists who said, let's make life better for the average person, or do we fight for the advancements that we've got? And I think that's what we need to recognize is. We either take some responsibility for creating the world that we want to live in, or we're going to be subject to the whims of an elite that I would suggest doesn't really have much value for us other than hewers of wood and carriers of water, right?
Amen, brother.
Matt, thanks for joining us. Fascinating conversation. Matt generously sent me his books, and I have to say there's a pretty intriguing history of Canada in particular and the United States that we're not aware of, that I think is helpful to understand the context of what we're in today.